Alright, and welcome to the third and last recording for Plato's Phaedo. This is the section where Socrates presents the argument that the soul must be undying. Now, he's going to reference the world of the forms here and the perfect idea, well, the forms, they are perfect ideas. So just a quick recap on that. Remember, this is the idea that our soul has come from another world. In other texts, Plato refers to this as the world of being. Within this world, they've had access to perfect ideas for everything. And so he's going to talk about things like the form of hot and cold, or the form of oddness and evenness. Now, he'll use this to show that anything that possesses a form can't also possess the opposing form. So, for example, fire possesses the form of hotness. It can't also possess the form of coldness. Anything that possesses a form can't possess an opposing form. It also can't accept anything which itself possesses the opposing form. So fire possesses hotness. It can't accept snow, which possesses coldness. If these two come in contact with each other, one of them must perish. What he's going to use this for is to show that, well, the soul possesses the form of life. It is what gives the body life. It contains life. And therefore it can't possibly possess its opposing form, which is death. And as such, the soul must be undying. So this is a relatively short little section that we'll read. And we don't get like an italicized start to this because we're kind of jumping in halfway through a conversation. So just to be clear, it's going from Socrates had listened with his head turned towards the speaker. So here we go. Socrates had listened with his head turned towards the speaker. "How brave of you to refresh my memory," he said. "But you don't realize the difference between what we are saying now and what we said then. Then we were saying that opposite things come from opposite things. Now we are saying that the opposite itself can never become opposite to itself, neither the opposite which is in us, nor that which is in nature." Don't worry too much about this first little part. Then, my friend, we were speaking about objects which possess opposite qualities and calling them by their names of the latter. But now we are speaking about the qualities themselves, from whose presence in them the objects which are called after them derive their names. We maintain that the opposites themselves would absolutely refuse to tolerate coming into being from one another. As he spoke, he looked at Sebes. "I suppose that nothing in what he said worried you too, Sebes?" "No, not this time," said Sebes, "though I don't deny that a good many other things do." So we agree upon this as a general principle. This is sort of where we're really starting off from, that an opposite can never be opposed to itself. So I don't know why they're saying an opposite can never be opposed to itself, but something can't be the opposite of what it is. Odd can't be even. They are opposed to each other. Absolutely. Then consider this point too, and see whether you agree about it too. Do you admit that there are such things as heat and cold? Well, yes, I do. Again, the Socratic method here, he builds up an argument with very basic premises, which you kind of have to agree with. I mean, imagine someone coming up to you and saying, "Do you admit that there's such a thing as hot and cold?" What are you going to say? No. Of course you're going to say yes. And so what Socrates does is sort of lead the person that he's conversing with down this path, and then when they arrive at their destination, they're at a place where they never expected to be. But Socrates does it by presenting very clear and precise premises that you really can't disagree with. And so if those premises put together lead to that destination, well, you kind of have to accept the destination. But continuing on. Yes, I do. Do you think that they are the same as snow and fire? Well, certainly not. Heat is a quality distinct from fire, and cold distinct from snow. Yes. So heat is not the same as fire. Fire possesses heat, but to say that heat is fire is not necessarily correct, and same with snow and cold. But I suppose you agree, in the light of what we said before, that snow, being what it is, can never admit heat and still remain snow, just as it was before. only with the addition of heat. It must either withdraw at the approach of heat or cease to exist. Quite so. Again, fire must either retire or cease to exist at the approach of cold. It will never have the courage to admit cold and still remain fire, just as it was, only with the addition of cold. That is true. So what he's talking about here is the separation between the form of heat and cold versus the actual object themselves, fire and snow. Fire possesses the form of heat. It cannot accept the form of cold. If it does, well then the heat leaves it, and so it will no longer be fire, and vice versa for snow. So we find that in certain cases like these, that the name of the form is eternally applicable not only to the form itself, but also to something else, which is not the form, but invariably possesses its distinguishing characteristic. And that's an important little section there. It's sort of Socrates saying, okay, well, this is what we've agreed to. But perhaps another example will make my meaning clearer. Oddness, and here we mean odd as in odd numbers, not oddness as in strange, just to be clear. Oddness must always be entitled to this name, odd, by which I am now calling it. Isn't that so? Certainly. This is the question. Is it unique in this respect, or is there something else, not identical with oddness, to which we are bound always to apply not only its own name, but that of odd as well, because by its very nature it never loses its oddness? What I mean applies to the number 3. There are plenty of other examples, any odd number, but take the case of 3. Don't you think that it must always be described not only by its own name, 3, but by that of odd, although odd and 3 are not the same thing? So what he's pointing out here is that 3 always possesses the form of odd. And what he's saying here is it's impossible for you to be referring to 3 without also referring to oddness. You just can't do it. And so oddness and 3 must always go together. It is the very nature of 3 and 5 and all the alternate integers that every one of them is invariably odd, although it is not identical with oddness. So 3, 5, 7, etc. They're not the same as oddness, but they all possess the form of oddness. Similarly, 2 and 4 and all the rest of the other series are not identical with even, but each one of them always is even. Do you go along with this or not? Of course I do. Then pay careful attention to the point which I want to make, which is this. It seems clear that the opposites themselves do not admit one another, but it also looks as though any things which, though not themselves opposites, always possess an opposite quality, similarly do not take on the opposite idea to that which is in them, but on its approach either cease to exist or retire before it. So here he's talking about the idea that, okay, so oddness and evenness are always opposed to each other. Okay, they will never accept each other. They're the opposites of each other. 3 is not necessarily the opposite of 2. We wouldn't say that the opposite of 3 is 2. That's not correct. But because 3 possesses the form of odd and 2 possesses the form of even, the two can never accept each other. And if you think about this, you might be thinking, well, what if we add 2 and 3 together? Well, what we get is 5, which is an odd number, so evenness has had to depart. So the evenness that we saw in 2 has had to leave when we've put 2 and 3 together. Nothing can be put together and still maintain both odd and even. One of these two is going to perish and one of them is going to stick around. So the forms don't just oppose each other, they don't just reject each other, is probably a good way to put it, but anything which possesses that form also rejects anything which possesses the opposing form. Okay, so 3, which possesses the form of odd, rejects 2, which is the form of even. Okay, if they're put together, then something must give, essentially. Surely we must assert that 3 will sooner cease to exist or suffer any other fate than submit to become even while it is still 3. Certainly, said Cebes. and yet 2 and 3 are not opposites. So it is not only the opposite forms that cannot face one another's approach, there are other things too which cannot face the approach of opposites. That is quite true. Shall we try, if we can, to specify what sort of things these are? By all means. Well then, Sevis, would this describe them, that they are things which compel whatever they get a hold onto assume not only their own idea, but invariably also some other idea which is an opposite? What do you mean? Just what we were saying a minute ago. You realize, I suppose, that when the idea of 3 gets a hold on any group of objects, it compels them to be odd as well as 3. Certainly. Then I maintain that into such a group of opposite idea, the opposite idea to the character which has this effect can never enter. No, it can't. And it was the form of odd that had this effect. Yes. And the opposite of this is the form of even. Yes. So the form of even will never enter into 3. No, never. In other words, 3 is incompatible with evenness. Quite so. So the number 3 is uneven. Yes. A bit of a frustrating exchange here, but by the end, what have we agreed to? That 3 is odd and not even. Let's move on. I propose now to describe what sort of thing they are. They are which, although they are not themselves directly opposed to a given opposite, nevertheless do not admit it, as in the present example. 3, although not the opposite of even, nevertheless does not admit it, because 3 is always accompanied by the opposite of even, and similarly with 2 and odd, or fire and cold, and hosts of others. Well, see whether you accept this definition. So, highlight this. Not only does an opposite not admit its opposite, but if anything is accompanied by a form which has an opposite and meets that opposite, then the thing which is accompanied never admits the opposite of the form by which it is accompanied. Now, a tricky little sentence here, but it's saying what I said a little bit earlier, which is not only does odd oppose even, as in the forms actually oppose each other, but what we also get is anything that possesses odd. So, for example, 3 is in possession of the form odd. It also opposes anything which possesses the form of even. Okay, so even though 3 is not the opposite of even, we would never say that the opposite of even is 3, it still opposes it. Why? Because it does hold the opposing form of oddness. Let me refresh your memory. There is no harm in hearing a thing several times. 5 will not admit the form of even, nor will 10, which is double 5, admit the form of odd. Twin has an opposite of its own, but at the same time it will not admit the form of odd. Nor will 1 1/2 or other fractions such as 1/2 or 3/4 and so on admit the form of whole, assuming that you follow me and agree. I follow and agree perfectly, said Sevis. Then run over the same ground with me from the beginning, and don't answer in the exact terms of the question, but follow my example. I say this because besides the safe answer that I described at first, as the result of this discussion, I now see another means of safety. Suppose, for instance, that you ask me what must become present in a body to make it hot. I shall not return the safe but simplistic answer that it is heat, but a more sophisticated one based on the results of our discussion, namely, that it is fire. And if you ask what must become present in a body to make it diseased, I shall say not disease, but fever. So what Socrates is pointing out here is that, well, what this means is, when we're talking about something possessing a form, it must in this physical world, it must possess something in this physical world which itself possesses the form. So what makes us sick isn't sick. What makes us diseased isn't disease. It is fever in this case. So I know the language is a bit tricky here because we use these words a little bit differently. And again, the idea that what gives our body heat is fire seems a little bit odd, but let's just go along with it. Similarly, if you ask what must become present in a number to make it odd, I shall say not oddness, but unity, and so on. See whether we have a sufficient grasp now of what I want from you. Quite sufficient. So in other words, he's saying, okay, well, let's not say that something possesses a form because it possesses the form. So something isn't hot because it's hot. Okay, or something doesn't have heat because it's hot. Something isn't odd because it's odd. This is an unsatisfactory answer. It's odd because it has something. It's hot because it has something. It's cold because it has something. So there is something about it which allows it to hold that form. Okay, so this is what Simius has just agreed to, that there must be something which allows the form to sort of attach to. We're not hot because we're hot. We're hot because of fire. So, the little italicized part here. Socrates argues that the soul is such a thing which always brings a quality to that which it occupies, and cannot itself be coupled with the opposite quality. It must retire or perish. Then tell me, what must be present in a body to make it alive? The soul, says Simius. I think we're actually talking to Sebes here. Is this always so? Of course. So, whenever soul takes possession of a body, it always brings living with it. Yes, it does. Is there an opposite to living or not? Yes, there is. What is it? Dying. So, what Socrates is saying here is, well, just like odd has the opposite form of even, living has the opposite form of dying. Does it follow then from our earlier agreement that soul will never admit the opposite of that which accompanies it? Most definitely, said Sebes. Well now, what name did we apply just now to that which does not admit the form of even? Uneven. And what do we call that which does not admit justice or uncultured, or culture? Uncultured, and the other unjust. Very good. And what do we call that which does not admit dying? Undying. And soul does not admit death. No. So the soul is undying. Yes, it is undying. Well, said Socrates, can we say that that has been proved? What do you think? Most completely, Socrates. Isn't that, like, nice? There you go. Absolute proof, according to Socrates, that our soul is undying. Maybe not quite. But at the end here, Socrates basically presents his argument in standard form. What do we call something that's is the opposite of dying? Undying. The soul is the opposite of dying, therefore the soul is undying, is kind of what we see at the end here. So that finishes off the Phaedo. Remember, from this we've got that we exist as two separate things, a physical body and a non-physical soul. The soul is what drives the body. It is kind of the little man inside us that animates us and makes us do everything. And it possesses certain qualities, such as that of living, and so it cannot possess the quality of death either. Therefore, our soul must be an undying entity. So there you go. I hope this makes you feel a little bit better. We've just proved, according to Socrates, that we're going to live forever, or at least our soul will. I'll see you in the world of being, everyone. Make sure that you subscribe so you get the next video, and have a great day. I'm going to go and contemplate the forms. Bye.